Welcome, everyone. Tonight's story follows a single day's walk through Paris, a journey of 15 kilometers across one of the world's most beautiful and historically rich cities. You'll hear about the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which has stood for nearly 1500 years, about Baron Haussmann's radical transformation of medieval Paris in the 1850s, and about the Seine River that has flowed through the city since long before humans built anything on its banks. You'll learn about Catherine de' Medici, an Italian girl who became Queen Mother of France and created the Tuileries Gardens as her refuge from a hostile court, about the Paris Commune of 1871, when working-class Parisians briefly governed themselves, and about the beautiful Notre Dame. If you fall asleep before the story ends, that's perfectly fine. Let the rhythm of footsteps on ancient cobblestones carry you into peaceful rest. Get comfortable, let your breathing slow and relax. Now close your eyes and let yourself drift to a September morning in Paris as our story begins. I pushed open the heavy glass door of Café de Flore at 9 in the morning, stepping into a space that had absorbed more than a century of Parisian life into its very walls. The aroma struck me immediately. Espresso so dark and bitter it seemed to darken the air itself, mingling with the yeasty warmth of croissants emerging from ovens in the back kitchen. Beneath these dominant scents lay others, the sharp tang of citrus from freshly squeezed orange juice, the sweetness of confectioner's sugar dusted over pastries, the faint smokiness that clung to the air from decades of cigarettes, despite the smoking ban that had been in place for years. The cafe hummed with its morning rhythm, porcelain cups meeting saucers with precise clicks, conversations murmuring in rapid French, the espresso machine releasing steam in sharp, intermittent bursts that punctuated the ambient noise like exclamation points. I took a small marble-topped table by the window, positioning myself to watch Boulevard Saint-Germain as it awakened to the day. The marble was cool beneath my fingertips, worn smooth by more than a century of hands, elbows, coffee cups, and wine glasses. The waiter who approached, a man perhaps 65, with silver hair combed carefully back and the erect posture of someone who took pride in his profession, brought me a café crème without waiting for my order. His movements were economical and practiced, the result of thousands of identical gestures performed over decades. In his eyes I recognized the assessment that comes from years of reading customers, that particular Parisian ability to discern what a person needs before they know it themselves. He set the cup down with a gentle clink, nodded almost imperceptibly, and retreated without a word. The coffee was flawless. The creamer floated on top in perfect foam. The milk steamed to precisely the right temperature and texture. I let the first sip rest on my tongue, feeling the heat spread through my chest, and considered the weight of history compressed into this single room. Since 1887, this cafe had served as a gathering place for minds that would reshape Western thought. Jean-Paul Sartre had occupied these tables for hours, sometimes for entire days, writing philosophy that would define a generation's understanding of existence and freedom. Simone de Beauvoir had sat here with him, smoking cigarettes and burning small marks into the wooden furniture. Small acts of rebellion that the cafe had preserved rather than repaired, recognizing them as historical artifacts. Albert Camus had been here, as had Picasso, Hemingway, and countless others whose names had become synonymous with 20th century culture. The intellectuals and artists who had filled these chairs had arrived unknown and left famous, their conversations seeping into the plaster and wood, their thoughts crystallizing in the tobacco-stained air. The walls were covered with photographs and paintings, documentation of the cafe's illustrious past. I studied them as I drank my coffee, black and white images of men in suits and women in elegant dresses, everyone smoking, everyone engaged in intense conversation. The images captured a Paris that no longer existed, a city of intellectual ferment and artistic revolution, when cafes were not simply places to drink coffee, but laboratories where new ways of thinking about the world were developed and tested. But I had not come to sit all day, tempting as that prospect was. I had mapped out an ambitious route across Paris, from this café in Saint-Germain-des-Prés to a restaurant in the Marais, a walk that would take me through layers of the city's accumulated history. It was a journey of perhaps 15 kilometers, depending on my exact route, and it would require the better part of the day. I had worn comfortable shoes, crucial for such an undertaking, and brought nothing with me but a small notebook, a pen, and enough euros for coffee, lunch, and dinner. Everything else I would gather along the way. Impressions, observations, the physical experience of moving through the city on foot. I finished my coffee, savouring the last drops, and left euros on the marble table. The waiter appeared as if summoned, swept up the money with a practised motion, and gave me a small smile that seemed to wish me well on whatever enterprise I was undertaking. I stood, feeling my muscles prepare themselves for the long walk ahead, and stepped back into the September morning. The air outside was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of early autumn light that makes everything appear slightly more defined, edges sharper, colours more saturated. The temperature was perhaps 18 degrees Celsius, cool enough to be comfortable for walking, warm enough that I wouldn't need more than a light jacket. Boulevard Saint-Germain stretched away in both directions, already busy with morning traffic. Cars and buses and motorcycles weaving through the streets, pedestrians hurrying to work or ambling toward breakfast, delivery trucks double parked with their hazard lights blinking. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés rose ahead of me, its Romanesque tower stark against the soft blue sky. I walked toward it slowly, taking in the details of the building's exterior. The church had been founded in 558 AD by King Childebert I, son of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. At that time, Paris was still emerging from Roman rule, still finding its identity as a Frankish city rather than a Roman outpost. The city was small then, confined largely to the Ile de la Cité, with only scattered settlements on the banks. The abbey had been built outside the city walls, in what was then countryside, as a burial place for Merovingian kings. The tower I was looking at dated from the year 1000. It had stood for more than a millennium, weathering everything history could throw at it. It had survived Viking raids in the 9th century, when Norse longships sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris repeatedly. It had survived the 100 Years' War, when English armies occupied parts of France and Paris was periodically under siege. It had survived the wars of religion in the 16th century, when Catholics and Protestants tore France apart in savage fighting. It had survived the Revolution, when churches were desecrated and priests were murdered, and Christianity itself, was briefly replaced by the cult of reason. It had survived 2 world wars, German occupation, and the liberation. The tower had witnessed all of it, silent and enduring. Inside the church lay the tomb of René Descartes, the philosopher who had sought to strip away all assumption and rebuild certainty from first principles. I think, therefore I am. That simple statement had revolutionized philosophy, placing consciousness and individual thought at the center of existence. Descartes had died in Stockholm in 1650, but his bones had been brought back to Paris and interred here, in this ancient church, where his doubts were laid to rest in stone and silence. I circled the building, running my hand along walls that held 1,000 years of Parisian weather in their texture. The stone was cool and slightly rough, pitted by centuries of rain and wind. I could feel the history in it, the way the surface had been worn by time and touch. Small plaques marked various historical moments. Renovations, dedications, commemorations. The church had been rebuilt and modified countless times over the centuries, each generation adding its own layer to the accumulated structure. From the church I turned north toward the Seine, walking through narrow streets that had survived Baron Haussmann's massive reconstruction of Paris in the 1850s and 1860s. These streets, Rue de l'Échaudé, Rue Cardinal, Rue de l'Abbaye, dated from the Middle Ages, when this neighbourhood had been a warren of narrow lanes and small buildings crowded together within city walls. The buildings that lined them now were mostly from the 17th and 18th centuries, their facades showing the classical restraint that had characterized Parisian architecture before Haussmann's intervention. Haussmann's transformation of Paris was one of the most ambitious urban planning projects in history. Hired by Napoleon III in 1853, Georges-Eugène Haussmann had been given virtually unlimited power and resources to modernize the city. What he created was revolutionary in both its scale and its vision. Over 17 years, he demolished 20,000 buildings, 40% of the buildings in central Paris. He displaced hundreds of thousands of residents, primarily the working poor who had lived in the medieval core of the city. He carved wide boulevards through neighborhoods that had stood since the Middle Ages, creating the grand vistas and uniform architecture that now define Paris in the popular imagination. The reasons for this massive undertaking were complex. Officially, Haussmann was modernizing Paris, improving sanitation, reducing crowding, creating parks and public spaces. The new boulevards allowed air and light to penetrate neighborhoods that had been dark and cramped. They made it possible to install modern infrastructure: sewers, gas lines, water pipes. The old Paris had been unsanitary and unhealthy, with frequent outbreaks of cholera and typhoid. The new Paris would be clean and orderly, a model for modern urban living. But there were other motivations, less openly discussed. The narrow medieval streets had made Paris easy to barricade and difficult for military forces to control. During the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, working-class Parisians had repeatedly erected barricades and fought government troops in the twisted lanes of the old city. The new boulevards made barricades impossible and allowed cavalry and artillery to move freely. The working-class neighborhoods that were demolished were replaced by buildings too expensive for the poor, pushing them to the outskirts of the city. Haussmann's Paris was not just more beautiful and more sanitary, it was more controllable more ordered, more conducive to the maintenance of state power. The Paris that emerged was breathtaking in its uniformity and grandeur. The cream-coloured buildings with their mansard roofs, the wide tree-lined boulevards, the grand perspectives from one monument to another. This was the Paris of postcards and paintings, the Paris that tourists came to see. But it came at an enormous cost. Entire communities vanished. Centuries of history were erased. A living, organic city was replaced by something more planned, more artificial, more stage-like. Critics at the time called it destruction, admirers called it progress. Both were right. I reached the Seine and paused on the Quai Malaquais, one of the streets that ran along the river's edge. The Seine moved past with its characteristic opacity, that greenish-brown colour that somehow managed to catch light and throw it back transformed. The river was perhaps 100 metres wide here, flowing west toward the sea, carrying the runoff from half of France toward the English Channel. Its current was gentle but persistent, sliding past the stone embankments with patient inevitability. A bateau mouche churned up river, fighting against the current, its glass roof glinting in the morning sun. These tourist boats, named for the Mouche district of Lyon, where they were originally manufactured, had become a quintessential Parisian sight, though locals generally avoided them. The passengers crowded against the windows, waved enthusiastically at people on shore, as if the entire city had gathered to witness their passage. A few people on the embankment waved back, entering into the brief, anonymous fellowship that such moments create. The Pont des Arts stretched ahead of me, its wooden planks worn smooth by millions of footsteps. This elegant pedestrian bridge had been built and rebuilt several times since the original was constructed in 1804. The current version, dating from 1984, was a careful reconstruction of the original design, maintaining the graceful iron arches and the wooden deck. For several years in the 2000s, the bridge had been famous for being covered with thousands of love locks, padlocks that couples attached to the railing as symbols of their eternal devotion. But the weight of all that love, tons of metal accumulating year after year, had threatened the structural integrity of the bridge, and the city had removed them all in 2015, replacing the railings with glass panels. The locks had been sold or melted down, the gestures of devotion transformed into scrap metal. I started across the bridge, my footsteps producing hollow sounds on the wooden planks. Other pedestrians crossed in both directions, joggers in athletic wear, tourists with cameras, Parisians on their way to work or appointments. The bridge was wide enough that we all moved easily past each other, each in our own trajectory, briefly sharing this space above the river. Halfway across, I stopped and turned to face upstream. The view opened up before me, one of those iconic Parisian perspectives that have been painted and photographed countless times, but still retain the power to stop you in your tracks. The Ile de la Cité sat in the river's centre, its buildings rising from the water as if they had grown there organically. Notre Dame dominated the island's eastern end, though now the cathedral wore scaffolding like bandages, the process of healing still underway after the devastating fire. I had been in Paris on the night of April 15th, 2019, when fire consumed Notre Dame's roof and toppled its spire. I had been having dinner with friends in a restaurant in the Marais when someone's phone buzzed with a news alert. Within minutes, we had all received the notification Notre Dame was on fire. We had paid hastily and rushed toward the river, joining thousands of others converging on the island. I had stood on this bridge, the Pont des Arts, watching the flames consume the roof, watching 8 centuries of craftsmanship burn. The fire had started sometime around 6:20 p.m., apparently in the attic space beneath the roof. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had already spread extensively through the oak timbers that formed the roof's framework. These timbers, called the forest because they consisted of thousands of oak trees, each timber cut from a single tree, dated from the 12th and 13th centuries. The trees had been saplings when William the Conqueror invaded England, had been mature forests when they were cut for Notre Dame's construction, and had held up the cathedral's roof for 800 years. Now they were being reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The spire, designed by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc during 19th century renovations and completed in 1859, had collapsed at 7:50 p.m. I had watched it fall, the entire structure tilting and then plunging downward into the burning building, sending up a geyser of sparks that rose into the darkening sky. Around me, people had gasped, some had cried out, some had simply wept. A few people sang hymns, most stood in stunned silence, united in witnessing the destruction of something we had all believed permanent. The firefighters had worked through the night, pouring water onto the flames from aerial platforms and from inside the building itself. By morning, they had saved the stone structure, the walls, the towers, the rose windows, but the roof was gone, the spire was gone, and the interior was heavily damaged by fire, smoke, and water. It had been, everyone agreed, a disaster, but it could have been worse. The entire building could have been lost. Now, more than 7 years later, reconstruction was well underway. The scaffolding that covered the cathedral was evidence of the enormous effort being devoted to restoring it. French president had promised that Notre Dame would reopen within 5 years of the fire, an ambitious timeline that many experts had considered impossible. But the work had progressed faster than expected, driven by a combination of government funding, private donations, and the determination of French craftspeople to restore their national monument. The cathedral was scheduled to reopen soon, its roof rebuilt, its spire reconstructed, its interior restored. Paris would have its heart back. I turned and continued across the bridge, leaving the view of Notre Dame behind. On the right bank, I turned east, following the Quai François Mitterrand along the river's edge. The Louvre sprawled to my right, that massive palace complex that had been a fortress, then a royal residence, then the largest museum in the world. The building's history was written in its architectural layers, the medieval fortress foundations still visible in the basement, the Renaissance facades of Francis I and Henry II, the classical additions of Louis XIV, the glass pyramid of Immersive that had provoked controversy when it was unveiled in 1989 and had since become beloved. The Louvre's collection was staggering in both its size and its significance. 38,000 objects on display, hundreds of thousands more in storage, spanning from ancient Mesopotamia to the mid-19th century. The Mona Lisa was here, and the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory of Samothrace, and thousands of other works that defined Western art history. One could spend days wandering through the galleries and still see only a fraction of what the museum contained. I did not enter. The Louvre demanded days, not hours, and I had committed myself to this walk, to experience in Paris horizontally rather than vertically, to cover in distance rather than depth. The museum would still be there tomorrow, next week, next year. It had been there for more than 2 centuries and would likely be there for centuries more. Today I was walking. Instead, I turned north, cutting through the Tuileries garden. I entered through the gates near the Place de la Concorde and walked east along one of the garden's main paths. The garden stretched before me in geometric perfection, gravel paths laid out in precise lines, flower beds arranged in careful patterns, trees planted in rows so straight they seemed to defy nature. The entire space expressed the French love of order, the belief that nature improved when shaped by human intelligence and will. Catherine de' Medici had created these gardens in 1564, modelling them on the Italian gardens of her childhood in Florence. She had arrived in France at 14 to marry the future King Henry II, a marriage arranged to bring Medici banking wealth into the French royal family. She was rich but not royal. Her grandfather had been Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of Florence and patron of Michelangelo and Leonardo. But the Medicis were merchants and bankers, not aristocrats by blood. The French court had made her aware of this distinction with cruel consistency, treating her as an upstart, an outsider, an Italian intruder. But Catherine had outlived them all. Henry II died in 1559 after being struck in the eye by a lance fragment during a tournament. Their 4 sons who survived infancy all became kings of France in succession: Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, though none proved particularly capable rulers. 3 of them died young, and the 4th was assassinated. Catherine served as regent for 2 of them and effectively ruled France for 30 years, navigating the catastrophic wars of religion that tore the country apart. She was ruthless when she needed to be. Historians still debate her role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Protestants were murdered in Paris. But she was also pragmatic, intelligent, and determined to preserve both the monarchy and France itself. These gardens were her refuge, a place where she could remember the Italy of her youth, where she could walk among familiar plants and fountains and feel, briefly, at home. She had built the Tuileries Palace here as well, an enormous structure that stood until 1871, when it was destroyed during the suppression of the Paris Commune. The palace was gone now, deliberately not rebuilt, but the gardens remained, still laid out according to Catherine's vision. The gardens had witnessed their own violence. During the siege of Paris in 1870–71, when Prussian forces surrounded the city and cut off all supplies, Parisians had been reduced to desperate measures to survive. They had eaten the animals from the zoo, the elephants and zebras and kangaroos, all slaughtered and sold for meat. They had eaten rats, which were trapped and sold in the markets. They had eaten anything they could find, and they had chopped down these chestnut trees for firewood, cutting down the decades-old trees that line the paths, burning them to stay warm during one of the coldest winters in memory. The siege had lasted 4 months, from September 1870 to January 1871, and had killed thousands. The German forces surrounding the city had been content to wait, knowing that starvation would eventually force surrender. Inside the city, the government of national defense had tried to maintain morale, launching several sorties to break the siege, but all had failed, with heavy casualties. By January, with food supplies exhausted and the population desperate, the government sued for peace, but Paris rebuilt, as it always did. After the war, the gardens were replanted, the trees replaced, the pathways restored. Now, a century and a half later, the gardens appeared serene and timeless, as if nothing unfortunate had ever disturbed them. The chestnut trees that shaded the paths were descendants of the trees that had replaced the trees that were burned. The garden's peace was built on layers of violence and renewal, tragedy and restoration. I walked through dapple shade, watching as morning joggers passed me on their circuits, as tourists stopped to take photographs, as elderly Parisians sat on metal chairs reading newspapers. The garden was public space, open to everyone, democratic in a way that much of Paris was not. Anyone could come here, sit in the shade, watch the fountains, feed the ducks in the ponds. It was one of the revolution's lasting gifts, the transformation of royal gardens into public parks, the opening of spaces that had once been reserved for the privileged few. I emerged from the gardens on the Rue de Rivoli and crossed into Place Vendôme, that perfect octagonal square dominated by the column at its centre. The square itself was a masterpiece of urban design, created in the late 17th century by Jules Hardouin Mansart, the architect who had also designed much of Versailles. The buildings surrounding the square were uniform in height and style, their facades forming a continuous architectural composition. The ground floors were occupied by luxury shops, jewellery stores primarily, the most expensive and exclusive establishments in Paris. Cartier, Boucheron, Chaumet, Van Cleef and Arpels, names that were synonymous with wealth and elegance. But it was the column that dominated the square, rising 44 metres from its base to the statue of Napoleon at its top. Napoleon had commissioned the column in 1806 to commemorate his greatest military victory, the Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2nd, 1805. At Austerlitz, Napoleon had defeated the combined forces of Russia and Austria, destroying the Third Coalition and establishing French dominance over continental Europe. It had been his masterpiece of military strategy, a victory so complete that it was studied in military academies for generations afterward. The column itself was extraordinary in both its construction and its symbolism. It was modelled on Trajan's column in Rome, that ancient monument celebrating the Roman emperor's victory over the Dacians. Napoleon, who saw himself as the heir to both the Roman Empire and Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, had ordered his column built to the same specifications and design. But the material was what made it remarkable. The column was constructed from bronze melted down from 1,250 Austrian and Russian cannons captured at Austerlitz. Napoleon had literally transformed his enemies' weapons into a monument to his own glory. The surface of the column was covered with a continuous spiral of bas-reliefs depicting Napoleon's campaigns, battles, sieges, surrenders, treaties. Reading from bottom to top, the reliefs told the story of Napoleon's rise to dominance, his victories accumulating as the spiral ascended. At the top stood a statue of Napoleon himself, dressed as a Roman emperor, gazing out over the city he had remade in his image. But nothing in Paris was truly permanent, and even Napoleon's monument had been subject to the city's turbulent history. in 1871 during the brief existence of the Paris Commune. Revolutionaries had toppled the column with ropes and pulleys, deliberately destroying what they saw as a symbol of militarism and imperial vanity. The painter Gustave Courbet, who had been involved in the decision to demolish the column, was later held financially responsible for its reconstruction and died in exile in Switzerland in 1877. Bankrupt and broken, the column had been re-erected in 1874, restored to its place as if the revolution had never happened. But the story of its destruction and reconstruction revealed something essential about Paris. The way the city's physical fabric was constantly being contested, torn down and rebuilt according to the ideologies of whoever held power at any given moment. Paris was not simply a collection of beautiful buildings. It was an argument in stone and bronze about what France was and what it should be. I circled the square slowly, looking up at the column, then walked north toward the Opéra Garnier. The streets I passed through, Rue de la Paix, Rue des Capucines, were lined with luxury shops, their windows displaying goods that existed at the intersection of craftsmanship and fantasy. Watches that cost as much as houses, handbags that required months on waiting list, jewellery that sparkled with the concentrated wealth of nations. The Opéra Garnier rose ahead of me, that Baroque temple to music and spectacle that Charles Garnier had designed after winning a competition in 1861. The building had taken 14 years to construct, from 1861 to 1875, and had employed the labour of thousands: stonecutters and carpenters, sculptors and painters, metalworkers and mosaicists. The cost had been enormous, more than 36 million francs, making it one of the most expensive buildings ever constructed. But the result justified the expense. Garnier had created something unprecedented, a building where every surface was decorated, where gold leaf covered acres of plaster, where marble from every quarry in France lined the walls. The exterior alone was overwhelming, a profusion of sculptural decoration, columns and arches, and niches filled with statues, friezes depicting musical instruments and theatrical masks, busts of composers gazing down from the facade. The colour scheme was dramatic: white and coloured marble, green copper roofing, gold leaf catching the light. It was architecture, as opera, as spectacle, as an argument that more was better and excess was not enough. The grand staircase inside, which I had climbed on a previous visit, was even more spectacular. It consumed 30 different types of marble, its steps and balustrades and columns displaying the full range of stone colours and patterns available from French quarries. The ceiling was painted with allegorical figures, the railings were decorated with bronze sculptures, and the entire space was designed to transform anyone ascending it into a character in a play, into someone worthy of notice and admiration. Garnier had understood that opera was not simply about what happened on stage. It was about the social theatre that played out in the lobbies and boxes and corridors, about seeing and being seen, about displaying wealth and status and taste. The building was designed to facilitate this social performance, creating spaces where the audience could admire each other as much as they admired the performers. The famous boxes, with their red velvet seats and gilt decorations, were arranged not just for viewing the stage, but for viewing other boxes, for seeing who was there and who was sitting with whom and what they were wearing. Beneath the opera house lay something few visitors knew about: a lake, During construction, workers had discovered an underground water table, a subterranean reservoir fed by groundwater that threatened to flood the foundation. Rather than try to eliminate the water, an impossible task, Garnier had built a massive concrete cistern to contain it, creating an artificial lake in the building's depths. The lake was about 5 meters deep and covered a significant area beneath the stage. It served multiple purposes. It acted as a counterweight, stabilizing the foundation. It provided water for the fire suppression system. And it created a mysterious hidden space that captured the imagination. This hidden lake had inspired Gaston Leroux to write The Phantom of the Opera, published in 1910. Leroux had worked as a journalist and had toured the opera house extensively, learning about its secret passages and hidden rooms and the lake below the stage. He had imagined what might dwell in those unreachable spaces, and he had created Eric, the phantom who lived in the depths of the opera house, emerging at night to watch performances from Box 5 and to pursue his obsessive love for the singer Christine Daae. The novel had become a sensation, and the opera house itself had become inseparable from the fiction. Tourists searching for evidence of the phantom in every shadow and corridor. I circled the opera house slowly, taking in its details, then continued east along Boulevard Haussmann. This wide avenue, named for the man who had created it, cut through the 9th arrondissement, lined with department stores and grand hotels. I passed Galeries Lafayette, that famous shopping destination with its Art Nouveau dome, its stained glass ceiling rising above the main floor like a cathedral to commerce. The building dated from 1912, and its dome was considered one of the finest examples of Art Nouveau architecture in Paris. Its coloured glass arranged in intricate patterns that filtered light into the shopping floors below. But I wasn't in a shopping mood. I was in a walking mood, which was an entirely different state of mind. Shopping required attention to detail, comparison of options, decisions about value and desire. Walking required only movement, attention to surroundings, openness to whatever might appear around the next corner. I turned north, heading toward Montmartre, and the city shifted around me. The character of Paris changed as I walked. Fewer tourists appeared on the streets, replaced by actual Parisians going about their actual lives. Workers heading to job sites, mothers pushing strollers, elderly people walking slowly with shopping bags. The buildings were a bit more worn, their facades showing the patina of age and use, rather than the polished perfection of the tourist districts. The shops sold practical goods, hardware and housewares, bread and meat, newspapers and tobacco. This was residential Paris, the city where people lived rather than the city they visited. At the base of Montmartre, I looked up at the steep ascent and made my choice. The stairs rather than the funicular. The funicular was practical, efficient, and required no effort. The stairs, all 298 of them, were work, but they allowed a slower appreciation of the climb, a physical engagement with the hill that the funicular bypassed. I wanted to earn the view that awaited at the top. I started up the Rue Foyatier stairway, the main pedestrian route ascending Montmartre. The steps were steep and uneven in places, worn by millions of footsteps over the decades. My legs began to burn at step 50. By step 100, I was breathing hard. By step 150, I was questioning my decision. By step 200, I was cursing my ambition. But I pushed on, stopping occasionally to catch my breath and to look back at the expanding view of Paris below. This hill, the Butte Montmartre, had been the site of some of the most dramatic moments in Parisian history. Its name, Montmartre, the Mount of Martyrs, came from the tradition that Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, had been martyred here in the 3rd century. According to legend, after Roman authorities beheaded him on this hill, Denis had picked up his severed head and walked 6 kilometers north, preaching a sermon the entire way, before finally collapsing at the site where the Basilica of Saint-Denis would later be built. It was an appropriately dramatic origin story for Paris's most dramatic neighborhood, but the more recent history was even more compelling. The Paris Commune, that brief socialist government that ruled Paris for 72 days in 1871, had begun here, on this hill, with an act of resistance that sparked a revolution. On March 18th, 1871, at dawn, French government troops climbed Montmartre with orders to seize cannons that the National Guard had positioned on the heights. France had just lost the Franco-Prussian War, and the government, retreating to Versailles, feared that the armed National Guard units in Paris might revolt. The cannons on Montmartre were particularly concerning. They had been purchased by public subscription during the siege. They belonged to the people of Paris rather than the government, and they commanded the approaches to the city. But when the soldiers arrived to take the cannons, they found themselves surrounded by the working-class residents of Montmartre. Men, women, and children who poured into the streets to protect their artillery. The crowds were mostly peaceful but insistent. They surrounded the soldiers, talked to them, offered them food and wine, appealed to their sense of solidarity with ordinary Parisians. Hours passed. The soldiers, many of whom came from working-class backgrounds themselves, began to waver. The commanding general, Claude Lecompte, ordered his troops to fire on the crowd. They refused. Some soldiers began fraternizing openly with the Montmartre residents. Lecompte ordered them to fire again. Again they refused. And then, in a moment that changed history, the soldiers arrested their own generals. Lecompte and another general, Jacques-Léon Clément Thomas, were taken to a house on the Rue des Rosiers, subjected to a brief show trial, and executed by firing squad in the garden. The rebellion had begun. Within hours, the uprising spread across Paris. Workers seized control of the city, occupying government buildings, setting up barricades, and declaring the establishment of the Paris Commune, a revolutionary government based on socialist principles. For 72 days, Paris governed itself democratically, implementing radical policies: separation of church and state, education reform, workers' rights, women's rights. The communards, as they called themselves, believed they were creating a new kind of society, a model for how cities and nations could be organized from the bottom up rather than from the top down. But the French government in Versailles could not allow this challenge to stand. In May 1871, government troops launched an assault on Paris, breaking through the city's defences and fighting their way through the streets in a week of brutal combat that became known as Bloody Week. The fighting was savage and the reprisals even more so. Communards set fire to government buildings, the Tuileries Palace, the Hôtel de Ville, the Palais de Justice, preferring to destroy them rather than let them be retaken. Government troops executed suspected communards on sight. sometimes in mass shootings against cemetery walls. The fighting was worst here in Montmartre, where the Commune had begun. Government forces took the hill after fierce resistance, and the executions that followed were extensive. Estimates of the total dead during Bloody Week range from 10,000 to 30,000, with thousands more arrested and deported to penal colonies in New Caledonia in the Pacific. The Commune was crushed, its leaders killed or exiled, its dream of a workers' government destroyed. I reached the top of the stairs, my legs trembling with effort, and turned to face the view. Paris spread below me in all its geometric precision. Haussmanns, radiating boulevards, clearly visible from this height. The Seine cutting through the centre in its gentle curves. The Eiffel Tower rising in the distance. The modern towers of La Défense, visible on the far horizon, like monuments to a different era entirely. The view was spectacular, worth every burning muscle in my legs. Sacré-Cœur rose behind me, that white Romano-Byzantine basilica that looked as if it had been imported from Constantinople by some architectural magic. The church gleamed in the morning sun, its white travertine stone almost luminous. Construction had begun in 1875, just 4 years after the Commune's suppression, and the timing was not coincidental. The basilica had been conceived as an act of penance for France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, penance for the sins of the Commune, penance for a nation that had lost its way and needed to return to Catholic faith and conservative values. The architect, Paul Abadi, had chosen a specific type of travertine limestone from Chateau Landon that possessed unusual properties. When exposed to rain, the stone exuded calcite, a white mineral that gradually covered the surface. As a result, the building cleaned itself with every rain, growing whiter as it aged rather than darkening like most stone buildings. It was a kind of architectural self-righteousness made literal, the church purifying itself continuously, becoming ever more pristine as time passed. The location was also significant as the basilica had been built on the heights of Montmartre, on the site where the Commune had begun, a deliberate assertion of Catholic and conservative authority over revolutionary memory. Where the communards had raised red flags and sung the Internationale, now a massive church dominated the skyline, its white domes visible from across Paris, a permanent reminder of which ideology had ultimately triumphed. I walked around to the side streets of Montmartre, away from the tourist crowds that clustered around Sacré-Cœur. Place du Tertre, that small square just behind the basilica, was already mobbed with portrait artists and caricaturists, their easels set up around the square's perimeter. Tourists sitting for portraits or browsing the artwork displayed on the railings. The scene was picturesque in a commercial sort of way, but it bore little resemblance to the Montmartre that had been the heart of a Parisian bohemia. In the 1880s and 1890s, Montmartre had been cheap and isolated, a working-class neighbourhood on the outskirts of Paris, where rent was affordable and landlords were tolerant. Artists had been drawn here by necessity. They were poor and needed inexpensive studios. But the neighbourhood had offered more than cheap rent. It had offered community, camaraderie, and freedom from the conventions and expectations of bourgeois Paris. Here, artists could live and work as they pleased, experimenting with new styles and techniques without worrying about academy approval or salon acceptance. The list of artists who had worked in Montmartre during this period read like a roll call of modernism's founding generation. Pierre-Auguste Renoir had a studio here and painted some of his most famous works, including Bal du Moulin de la Galette, depicting Montmartre's dance halls and gardens. Vincent van Gogh had lived here with his brother Theo, painting views of the neighbourhood from his apartment window. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec had made Montmartre his subject, immortalising the Moulin Rouge and its performers in posters and paintings that captured the neighbourhood's energy and decadence. Pablo Picasso had moved here in 1904, taking a studio in the Bateau Lavoir, a ramshackle building where he developed Cubism and painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Amedeo Modigliani, Maurice Utrillo, Suzanne Valadon, Georges Braque, all had lived and worked in Montmartre during its golden age. But that Montmartre was gone, transformed by its own success. As the artist became famous, the neighbourhood became fashionable. Rents rose. The working class residents were gradually displaced. By the 1920s, most of the avant-garde had moved to Montparnasse, on the left bank, seeking the cheap rent and tolerance that Montmartre no longer offered. Now Montmartre was primarily a tourist destination, its artistic heritage packaged and sold in the form of portrait sketches and watercolours of street scenes. I walked through quieter streets, Rue Courtauld, where the Montmartre Museum occupied a 17th century manor house, where Renoir and Dufy had once kept studios. Rue des Saules, which descended the northern slope of the butte past the last remaining vineyard in Paris. Rue Lepic, where Van Gogh had lived. These streets retained something of the neighbourhood's old character. Actual residents going about their lives, small shops and cafes that served locals rather than tourists, an atmosphere of lived-in authenticity rather than performed charm. I cut through Parc Monceau, one of Paris's most beautiful parks, created in the late 18th century as a fantasy landscape for the Duke of Orléans. The park was relatively small, just over 8 hectares, but it was exquisitely designed, with winding paths and artificial water features and carefully placed trees that created picturesque views from every angle. What made the park unusual, what gave it its particular character, was a collection of architectural follies scattered throughout the grounds. These were artificial ruins and exotic structures built specifically to create atmospheric effects, to give visitors the sense that they were wandering through a landscape of ancient mysteries and foreign wonders. There was a Roman colonnade, Corinthian columns arranged in a semicircle around an artificial pond that had never been Roman, never been part of an actual ancient structure, but had been built in the 1770s specifically to look ancient. There was an Egyptian pyramid, small and decorative, that had never been in Egypt. There had once been a Chinese pagoda, a Turkish tent, and a Dutch windmill, though some of these had been removed or relocated over the centuries. This taste for picturesque ruins and exotic architecture had been characteristic of 18th century aristocratic culture. The wealthy built private parks filled with architectural fantasies, creating landscapes where they could stroll and experience carefully curated emotions. Melancholy at ancient ruins, wonder at exotic structures, romantic contemplation of nature artfully arranged. It was nature as theatre, landscape as emotional manipulation. The park had survived the revolution and all of France's subsequent political upheavals, passing from private ownership to public control, but maintaining its essential character. Now Parisian children played on its lawns, joggers circled its paths, elderly people sat on benches feeding pigeons, and the artificial ruins remained, still creating their picturesque effects nearly 2.5 centuries after they were built. I emerged from the park on Boulevard de Courcelles and turned south, heading back toward the Seine. I passed through the 8th arrondissement, where Paris was at its most imperial and monumental. The Arc de Triomphe rose in the distance at the centre of the Étoile, the star, that massive roundabout where 12 avenues converged in a perfect radial pattern. Napoleon had commissioned the arch in 1806, after his victory at Austerlitz, intending it to honour the French army and its achievements. He had envisioned soldiers returning from campaigns and marching through the arch in triumph, celebrated by the nation they had defended and glorified. The design was based on the Arch of Titus in Rome, another example of Napoleon's desire to link himself to the Roman Empire and its traditions of military glory and imperial power. But like so many of Napoleon's projects, the Arc de Triomphe was not completed in his lifetime. Construction was slow, hampered by political instability and funding problems. Napoleon fell from power in 1814, returned briefly in 1815, then was defeated at Waterloo and exiled to St. Helena, where he died in 1821. The arch was not completed until 1836, more than 15 years after his death. By then, France had gone through 2 more revolutions, and had restored and then re-abolished the monarchy. Louis-Philippe, the citizen king, presided over the arch's inauguration, and he used the occasion to honour not Napoleon specifically, but the French army generally, the revolution, and the ideal of national glory that transcended any single ruler. The arch became a monument to French military achievement across all eras and regimes. The arch's symbolic function continued to evolve. The body of Napoleon was brought back from St. Helena in 1840 and passed under the arch on its way to Les Invalides. After World War I, the unknown soldier was buried beneath the arch, with an eternal flame that has burned continuously since 1923. The arch became a site of national mourning and memory, a place where France commemorated its dead and celebrated its survival. I didn't walk out to the arch. I'd done that on previous visits, had climbed the stairs inside and stood on top, looking down at the traffic circling below in that chaotic choreography that somehow worked, despite the apparent absence of rules. Today, I was conserving my energy for the kilometres still ahead. Instead, I turned east on the Champs-Élysées, walking down what was probably the most famous avenue in the world. The Champs-Élysées, the Elysian Fields, took its name from Greek mythology, from the paradise where heroes went after death. The name was aspirational, linking this Parisian boulevard to classical ideals of beauty and perfection. The avenue stretched nearly 2 kilometres from the Arc de Triomphe to the Place de la Concorde, a perfectly straight vista that Haussmann had preserved and enhanced during his renovations. The western portion, nearest the Arc de Triomphe, was lined with luxury shops, airline offices, car dealerships, and chain restaurants, commercial enterprises that catered to tourists and to wealthy Parisians. The eastern portion, as it descended toward the Place de la Concorde, was greener, with trees shading the sidewalks and gardens on either side. I walked the entire length slowly, my feet beginning to register their protest at the day's accumulated mileage. The avenue was crowded with tourists, people taking photographs, groups following tour guides who held up umbrellas or flags to keep their charges organized. The shops were expensive and often uninspiring international brands that could be found in any major city. But the scale of the avenue itself was impressive, the width allowing for multiple lanes of traffic in each direction, wide sidewalks and tree-lined medians. This was Haussmann's Paris at its most extreme. Urban planning as spectacle, as the creation of grand vistas that privileged appearance over human scale. I reached Place de la Concorde as the sun reached its apex, flooding the vast square with harsh midday light. The square spread before me 8 hectares of open space, one of the largest public squares in Europe. It was originally designed in the 1750s as Place Louis XV, a monument to the king, with an equestrian statue of Louis at its centre, but the square's history had been anything but peaceful. During the Revolution, the square was renamed Place de la Révolution, and it was here that the guillotine was erected. Between January 1793 and July 1794, during the period known as the Terror, more than 1,300 people were executed in this square. The list of the dead read like a who's who of French history. Louis XVI, executed January 21st, 1793. Marie Antoinette, executed October 16th, 1793. Georges Danton, one of the Revolution's leaders, executed April 5th, 1794, after falling out with Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre himself, executed July 28th, 1794, ending the Terror and beginning the Thermidorian reaction. The executions had been public spectacles, attended by thousands. The guillotine, that supposedly humane killing machine, invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a more egalitarian alternative to hanging or beheading with the sword, had made execution into a kind of theatre. The condemned were brought to the scaffold in carts surrounded by jeering crowds. They climbed the steps to the platform. The executioner positioned them beneath the blade, face down, neck exposed. The blade fell, severing the head in a fraction of a second. The executioner held up the head to show the crowd, who cheered or jeered depending on their opinion of the deceased. The body and head were thrown into a cart and hauled away for burial in mass graves. The scale of the killing had been unprecedented. Paris had never seen anything like it. Systematic executions, day after day, week after week, month after month, removing from life anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. Aristocrats, certainly, but also ordinary people accused of hoarding food or expressing doubts about the revolution's direction. Priests who refused to swear loyalty to the revolutionary state. Moderate revolutionaries who thought the terror had gone too far. Radical revolutionaries who thought it hadn't gone far enough. The terror devoured its own until finally the deputies of the National Convention, fearing for their own lives, turned on Robespierre and sent him to the same guillotine he had used so liberally on others. After the terror, the square was renamed Place de la Concorde, the Place of Concord, as if a new name could erase the memory of what had happened here. The obelisk, standing in the square's centre, was added in 1836, brought from the Temple of Luxor in Egypt. It was 3,300 years old, covered in hieroglyphs praising Rameses II, weighing 230 tons. The French government had acquired it as a gift from Muhammad Ali Pasha, Egypt's ruler, though gift was a polite term for what was essentially a transfer of cultural property from a weaker power to a stronger one, part of the complex politics of colonialism. The obelisk served as a neutral monument, something that predated all French political disputes and therefore couldn't be claimed by any particular faction. It was ancient, foreign, mysterious, covered in writing that most Parisians couldn't read, representing a civilization that had risen and fallen millennia before France existed. It made the recent violence seem small by comparison, temporary, a brief moment in the long sweep of history. I stood in the centre of the square and turned slowly, taking in the geometry. The obelisk marked the intersection of two axes, one running from the Madeleine Church to the north to the National Assembly to the south, and one running from the Champs-Élysées to the west to the Tuileries Garden to the east. Paris as sacred geometry, as a mandala of power and history, as something more than just a collection of streets and buildings. From Concorde, I walked along the Seine once more, this time on the right bank, heading east. The Grand Palais floated into view on my right, that impossible glass-roofed exhibition hall that looked as if it shouldn't be able to stand, but had been standing since 1900. It had been built for the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair, of 1900. One of several such expositions that Paris hosted between 1855 and 1937. These fairs were opportunities for France to showcase its achievements, industrial, artistic, colonial, and to compete with other nations who were hosting similar exhibitions. The 1900 exposition had been enormous, stretching across 112 hectares and attracting 50 million visitors over 7 months. The Grand Palais was just one of many buildings constructed for the event, but it was one of the few that survived. Its glass and steel construction represented the height of Belle Époque engineering, a building that combined classical stone facades with a modern glass roof that spanned 45 meters without internal supports. Inside, the space was vast and luminous, perfect for exhibitions and events. The Petit Palais stood across the street, a matching structure that now housed the city's Museum of Fine Arts. Between them ran the Pont Alexandre III, that outrageously ornate bridge I had crossed earlier in the day. All three structures, the two palaces and the bridge, had been built for the 1900 exposition, a coordinated architectural ensemble that transformed this section of riverfront into a monument to French achievement and taste. I crossed the Seine on the Pont Alexandre III again, returning to the left bank. The bridge's 4 pillars featured massive gilt sculptures, Fame on flying horses, Pegasus held by Fame, representing arts, sciences, commerce, and industry. The Art Nouveau lamps that lined the bridge were extraordinary in their detail, each one a work of sculptural art. The entire bridge was a celebration of decorative excess, every surface covered with some ornament or sculpture or flourish. It was the opposite of modernist simplicity. It was classical grandeur, filtered through Belle Époque sensibilities, proudly and even defiantly decorative. On the left bank, I found myself in the 7th arrondissement, walking east in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. The tower had been visible for much of my walk, a constant presence on the skyline, but I had deliberately saved my close encounter for this moment. The Eiffel Tower is so famous, so thoroughly photographed and reproduced, that actually seeing it in person creates a strange cognitive dissonance. You've seen it so many times that the real thing feels like a copy of the images rather than the original. But approaching it on foot, watching it grow larger with each step, restores some of its reality and power. It is genuinely massive, 324 meters tall, weighing approximately 10,000 tons, containing 18,038 pieces of puddled iron, held together by 2.5 million rivets. Gustave Eiffel had designed and built it in just over 2 years, from 1887 to 1889, for the Exposition Universelle that commemorated the centennial of the French Revolution. It was a demonstration of what was possible with iron construction, a monument to engineering and to the industrial age. Every piece was prefabricated in Eiffel's factory on the outskirts of Paris, brought to the site, and assembled with precision. The construction proceeded with remarkable speed and safety. Only one worker died during construction, a remarkably low figure for such a large and complex project. But the tower was controversial from the beginning. Before construction even started, a group of prominent artists and intellectuals published a letter in Le Temps protesting the project, calling it a useless and monstrous structure that would disfigure Paris. They complained that it would dominate the skyline, that it would overshadow Notre Dame and the Louvre, that it was an ugly industrial structure inappropriate for a city of art and beauty. Guy de Maupassant, the novelist, supposedly ate lunch in the Tower's restaurant regularly because it was the only place in Paris from which he couldn't see the tower. The tower was supposed to be temporary. The permit granted to Eiffel specified that the structure would be dismantled after 20 years, in 1909. This was standard practice for World's Fair architecture. Build temporary structures for the exposition, then tear them down afterward and use the materials elsewhere. But as 1909 approached, the tower had proven its worth in an unexpected way. It was an excellent platform for radio transmission. The French military had begun using it for radio communication, and the scientific community recognized its value for meteorological observations and other experiments. The demolition was cancelled and the tower remained. Over time, public opinion shifted dramatically. What had been criticized as ugly became celebrated as beautiful. What had been dismissed as temporary became embraced as permanent. The tower became the symbol of Paris, more recognizable than any other structure. Reproduced on everything from tea towels to refrigerator magnets to souvenir keychains. It appeared in countless paintings and photographs, in films and television shows, in advertising and propaganda. It became impossible to imagine Paris without it. I walked beneath the tower, positioning myself directly underneath, looking up at the way the four massive legs curved upward and inward to meet at the centre. From this angle, the engineering was clearly visible. The lattice work of iron pieces, the diagonal bracing, the way the structure narrowed as it rose. Every element served a function. There was no decoration separate from structure. The beauty was inherent in the honesty of the design, in the elegant solution to the problem of building a very tall tower that wouldn't fall down. The iron itself was beautiful in its way, a warm brownish colour, not quite rust, but not quite brown, something in between. The tower was repainted every 7 years, a process that required 25 painters working for 18 months, using 60 tons of paint. The colour was specific, Eiffel Tower brown, a shade chosen to harmonise with the Parisian skyline. I didn't go up. I'd been up on previous visits, had taken the elevator to the second platform and then the stairs to the top. had looked out over Paris from 276 meters up and felt that mixture of exhilaration and vertigo that comes from being so high above a familiar landscape. Today I was staying at ground level, experiencing Paris horizontally, and my feet were grateful for this decision. I continued east along the Quai d'Orsay, past the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an 18th century palace now protected by armed guards and surveillance cameras, and past the National Assembly, France's lower house of parliament, which occupied the Palais Bourbon on the Seine's left bank. The 7th arrondissement here was quiet and dignified, the Paris of government and diplomacy, of embassies and ministries. But then I crossed into the 6th arrondissement, and the atmosphere changed. This was the Paris of universities and bookstores, of cafes where students argued about philosophy, of small cinemas showing art films. I walked through streets lined with bookshops, Shakespeare and Company on the right bank, across the river, but also dozens of smaller bookstores specializing in philosophy, poetry, rare books, used books, books in foreign languages. I entered the Luxembourg Gardens through the southern entrance, off Boulevard Saint-Michel. The gardens spread before me in geometric perfection, the paths laid out in precise patterns, the flower beds arranged in formal designs, the trees planted in rows. In the centre stood the Luxembourg Palace, built in the 17th century for Marie de Medici and now home to the French Senate. The gardens were crowded with people enjoying the afternoon. Joggers circled the perimeter paths. Students sat on the grass reading or talking. Children pushed toy sailboats in the large pond with long sticks. The boats drifting across the water and occasionally colliding with each other. Old men played chess at stone tables under the shade of chestnut trees. Couples walked hand in hand along the tree-lined alleys. The gardens served as Paris's living room, a democratic space where anyone could come and spend time. Near the Medici fountain, I stopped to rest on a bench. My feet were beyond tired now. They had moved into a state of numbed rebellion, sending up protest signals that I was doing my best to ignore. I estimated I had walked perhaps 12 kilometers so far, with another 3 or 4 still ahead. The walk was taking longer than I'd anticipated, partly because I kept stopping to look at things, to absorb details, to think about history. The fountain itself was worth studying. It'd been built in the early 17th century in the style of an Italian grotto, with a long rectangular pool leading to a dramatic sculptural group at one end. The sculpture depicted a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Cyclops Polyphemus discovering the lovers Acis and Galatea in their hidden grotto, about to crush Acis with a boulder in jealous rage. It was a moment of suspended violence, the boulder raised but not yet thrown, Acis and Galatea unaware of the doom about to descend on them. The sculpture captured that instant of impending tragedy, freezing it in bronze for centuries of viewers to contemplate. I rested for perhaps 10 minutes watching people pass, then forced myself back to my feet. The final portion of my walk awaited. I exited the gardens on the eastern side and headed into the Latin Quarter proper. This neighbourhood, the 5th arrondissement, had been the intellectual heart of Paris since the Middle Ages, when the University of Paris was founded in the mid-12th century. The university had quickly become the most prestigious in Europe, attracting students and teachers from across Christendom. Thomas Aquinas had taught here in the 13th century, producing his massive Summa Theologica, that attempt to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Dante had studied here, so had Erasmus, Ignatius of Loyola, and John Calvin. For centuries, the university had defined European intellectual life, setting the curriculum that other universities copied, training the clergy and administrators who ran the church and served kings across the continent. The university's language of instruction was Latin, hence Latin Quarter, and this remained the case until the Revolution. For more than 6 centuries, Latin echoed through these streets, the language of learning and scholarship, of theological disputation and philosophical argument. Students came from across Europe, speaking dozens of different native languages, but they all learned Latin and conducted their studies in Latin, creating a kind of international intellectual community united by a common language. I walked through streets that still bore names related to the university and learning: Rue des Écoles, Rue de la Sorbonne, Rue Saint-Jacques. The Sorbonne itself, or rather the buildings that now house parts of the sprawling University of Paris system, occupied several blocks, their facades bearing inscriptions in Latin, their courtyards still used by students rushing between classes. The neighbourhood retained its intellectual character even now. Bookstores lined the streets, serious bookstores full of philosophy and theory, poetry and literary criticism, history and political science. Small cinemas showed classic films and foreign films and experimental films that would never play in commercial theatres. Cafes remained gathering places for students and professors, filled with people reading, writing, arguing about ideas. I crossed to the Ile de la Cité, the island where Paris had begun. 2,000 years earlier, when this island was occupied by the Parisi, a Celtic tribe from whom Paris took its name, it had been a small settlement, perhaps a few hundred people living in wooden houses, fishing in the Seine, trading with other tribes along the river. The Romans conquered Gaul in the 1st century BC, and the Parisi settlement became Lutetia, a Roman town that gradually expanded to both banks of the river. The Roman city had been relatively small and unimportant, overshadowed by Lyon and other Gallic cities, but it survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, and under the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties it grew in importance. By the medieval period, Paris had become the capital of France and one of the largest cities in Europe, and it all began here, on this island in the middle of the Seine. A few streets away stood Sainte-Chapelle, Louis IX's chapel built in the mid-13th century to house relics of Christ's Passion that he had purchased from the bankrupt Latin Emperor of Constantinople. The chapel was a reliquary made architectural, a jewelled box designed to hold and display sacred objects. The lower chapel was dim and intimate, designed for the palace staff and servants, but the upper chapel was transcendent. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase and emerged into a space that seemed made entirely of coloured light. 15-metre tall windows covered nearly every wall surface, 6,458 square feet of stained glass, depicting 1,113 scenes from the Old and New Testaments. The windows were organized to tell the story of salvation from Genesis to the Apocalypse, the biblical narrative unfolding in colored glass. When sunlight streamed through the windows, the entire space filled with jewel-toned light, deep blues and reds, purples and greens, gold and silver. The stone columns that supported the roof seemed to dissolve, becoming threads holding up a tent of glass. The ceiling arched overhead, painted midnight blue and studded with golden stars, a vision of the heavenly firmament. This was what medieval people meant when they described heaven as a city of crystal and precious stones. It wasn't metaphor, it was architecture. It was light transformed by coloured glass. It was the attempt to create on earth a space that gave people a glimpse of paradise, that made the invisible visible, that translated theological concepts into physical experience. I stood in the chapel for perhaps 15 minutes, watching the light shift and change as clouds moved across the sun, watching the colours intensify and fade, feeling the strange emotional effect that this space created, a mixture of awe and peace, of exaltation and humility, of feeling both very small and connected to something very large. I left the island and walked toward the Pantheon, that massive dome building that stood on the highest point of the left bank, the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, though mountain was rather generous for what was really just the highest of Paris's low hills. The Pantheon had been built as a church, the Church of Sainte-Geneviève, commissioned by Louis XV as an act of piety when he recovered from a serious illness. But before the church was completed, the Revolution transformed it into a secular temple, a monument to the great men of France. The inscription above the entrance read, Aux grands hommes, la patrie reconnaissante. To great men, the grateful homeland. The interior was designed like a classical temple, with massive columns supporting a dome nearly as large as St. Peter's in Rome. But instead of religious imagery, the walls were covered with murals depicting scenes from French history, Clovis converting to Christianity, Charlemagne being crowned emperor, Joan of Arc and her visions, the Revolution and the Republic. French history was presented as a kind of sacred narrative, a story of national greatness and achievement. In the crypt below, France's heroes were buried in positions of honour. Voltaire was here, the philosopher and writer whose satires had helped undermine the Ancien Régime. Rousseau was here, the political theorist whose social contract had provided intellectual justification for the revolution. Victor Hugo, the novelist and poet who had captured 19th century France in his works, was here. His funeral in 1885 had drawn 2 million people, one of the largest gatherings in Paris's history. Émile Zola, who had risked everything to defend Alfred Dreyfus and expose anti-Semitism in French institutions, was here. And Marie Curie was here, the first woman buried in the Pantheon on her own merits, rather than as someone's wife or daughter. Curie had won 2 Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry for her research on radioactivity. She had overcome enormous prejudice and discrimination, working in laboratories that wouldn't officially hire women, publishing research that male scientists tried to claim credit for, teaching at universities that initially refused to give her a formal position. Her burial in the Pantheon in 1995, more than 60 years after her death, was France's belated acknowledgement of her achievements. From the Pantheon, I walked east and then north, heading toward my final destination in the Marais. The afternoon sun was lowering now, light turning golden, shadows lengthening across the streets. My feet had moved well beyond protest into a state of numb endurance. I estimated I had walked perhaps 14 or 15 kilometres total, and the last stretch felt like the longest. I passed through residential neighborhoods, past the Jardin des Plantes, Paris's botanical garden and zoo, founded in the 17th century as the Royal Garden of Medicinal Plants. The garden had expanded over the centuries to encompass greenhouses, natural history museums, and extensive collections of living plants from around the world. I walked through beds of late summer flowers, dahlias and roses, salvia and lavender, past the great greenhouses with their iron and glass structures full of tropical plants. Inside the Natural History Museum, I made a brief detour to see the Gallery of Evolution. This Victorian hall was spectacular in its own way. A vast space with animals arranged in ecological groupings, as if caught mid-migration across the museum floor. Elephants and giraffes and zebras marched across the main hall. Lions and tigers prowled the edges. Whales hung suspended from the ceiling. The display was outdated in its taxonomy and its approach, a relic of 19th century natural history where museums were encyclopedic collections meant to display the full variety of creation. But it was also beautiful in its ambition and execution, a monument to a particular way of understanding and organizing knowledge about the natural world. I emerged from the museum back into the late afternoon sun and continued north toward the Place de la Bastille. This square marked the site of the famous prison, whose storming on July 14th, 1789, had become the symbol of the French Revolution. But nothing remained of the actual prison. It had been demolished stone by stone, deliberately destroyed, its rubble sold as souvenirs, or used to build the Pont de la Concorde across the Seine. The prison itself had been relatively small, capable of holding perhaps 40 prisoners at most. On July 14th, when the crowd stormed it, they found only 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned at his family's request. But the symbolic value was enormous. The Bastille represented royal tyranny, the power of the king to imprison anyone without trial simply by issuing a lettre de cachet, a sealed letter that authorized detention without any legal process. Destroying the Bastille was destroying that arbitrary power, asserting the right of people to be free from tyranny. Now a column rose from the centre of the square, topped by a golden winged statue, the Spirit of Liberty. But this column commemorated not the Revolution of 1789, but the July Revolution of 1830, when Parisians had risen up to depose the reactionary King Charles X and replace him with Louis Philippe, the citizen king. Revolution upon revolution, uprising upon uprising, the square accumulating layers of political meaning, until even the monuments became confused about which revolution they were commemorating. The sun was setting as I turned west into the Marais, heading toward my final destination. The Marais, the marsh, had been exactly that in medieval times, swampland along the Seine that was gradually drained and developed. In the 17th century, it became Paris's most fashionable neighborhood, filled with elegant private mansions, hotels particuliers, built by aristocrats and wealthy financiers. The Place des Vosges, Paris's oldest planned square, was here, its perfect symmetry and red brick facades representing the height of 17th century urban design. The restaurant where I had reserved a table stood on Rue des Rosiers, the street that ran through the heart of the Marais. It occupied the ground floor of a 17th century building, its facade showing the wear of 400 years. The interior featured exposed stone walls, heavy wooden beams crossing the ceiling, and candlelight that created an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy. The restaurant was called Le Temps Retrouvé, Lost Time, Regained, a reference to Proust's final novel, that meditation on memory and time, and the way the past could be recovered through sensory experience. It seemed an appropriate name after a day spent walking through layers of Parisian history, through centuries of accumulated time, compressed into 15 kilometers of streets and squares. The maitre d' greeted me at the door, his expression carefully neutral, as he assessed whether I was appropriately dressed, whether I had a reservation, whether I belonged in his establishment. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he smiled warmly and showed me to a table near the window overlooking the street. I collapsed into the chair with an audible groan. My feet throbbed, my legs ached with a deep soreness that promised tomorrow would be even more painful. But I felt profoundly, deeply satisfied. I had walked across Paris, really walked across it, experiencing the city at human speed, on foot, covering the distance with my own effort. The maitre d' brought me a menu, handwritten in elegant cursive on thick paper, and a wine list. I barely glanced at either, ordering the first thing that caught my eye, coq au vin, that classic French dish of chicken, braised in wine with mushrooms and onions. And wine, definitely wine, a red Burgundy that the maitre d' recommended with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his recommendation would be accepted. While I waited for my food, I looked out the window at Rue des Rosiers. Night had fallen, and the street lamps cast pools of golden light on the cobblestones. The street was quiet now, most shops closed, just a few people walking past, a couple holding hands, speaking softly in French, an elderly man walking slowly with a cane, a group of young people, students perhaps, laughing about something. The wine arrived, and I took a long sip. It was excellent, smooth and complex, with notes of cherry and earth, exactly what I needed after a day of walking. I thought about everything I had seen, trying to hold it all in my mind at once. The ancient abbey, the Seine flowing past unchanging, the scars of Haussmann's renovations, the Place de la Concorde and its bloody history, the Eiffel Tower's iron latticework, Montmartre and the Commune, the immigrant neighbourhoods where Paris was being continually remade, Notre Dame wrapped in scaffolding, Sainte-Chapelle's coloured light, the Luxembourg Gardens where Paris came to rest, the accumulated layers of history pressed into every street and building. The coq au vin arrived, and I realised I was ravenously hungry. I'd had only coffee for breakfast, chicken yassa for lunch, and had burned thousands of calories walking. The chicken was perfect, so tender it fell from the bone, the sauce rich with wine and mushrooms, deep and complex and satisfying. I ate slowly, savouring each bite, letting the food and wine restore me. When I finished the main course, the waiter cleared my plate and asked about dessert. I ordered tarte tatin without hesitation, that upside-down apple tart that had been invented by accident in the 1880s, when one of the Tatin sisters burned the apples she was cooking for a traditional tart, and improvised by putting the pastry on top and flipping the whole thing over after baking. Accidents becoming traditions, mistakes becoming classics, improvisation becoming canonical. It seemed very French, very Parisian. The tart arrived warm, the caramelized apples glistening with a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting into golden pools on the plate. I cut into it and the smell rose up. butter and caramelized sugar, the slight tartness of apples, vanilla from the ice cream. I took a bite and closed my eyes, letting the flavors and textures fill my awareness. The crisp pastry, the soft apples, the sweet caramel, the cold cream. I finished the tart and ordered coffee, espresso, small and strong, and sat back in my chair, feeling complete satisfaction. The day was ending as it had begun, with coffee having come full circle. When the bill arrived, I paid in cash, leaving a generous tip. The maitre d' appeared to help me with my jacket, thanking me for coming, hoping I had enjoyed my meal, wishing me a pleasant evening. His courtesy was genuine, warmed by the knowledge that I had appreciated his restaurant and would likely return. I stepped outside into the September night. The air was cool and lovely, with a slight breeze carrying the smells of the city. Bread from a nearby bakery, coffee from a cafe, the indefinable scent that was just Paris. I stood on the sidewalk, exhausted and content, and made a decision. I would take a taxi back to my hotel. I had walked far enough. I flagged down a passing cab and sank into the back seat with relief. As we drove through nighttime Paris, I watched the city slide past the windows, the buildings glowing golden in the streetlight, the river reflecting lights from the bridges and buildings, the monuments lit up dramatically against the dark sky. The taxi stopped at my hotel in the 7th arrondissement. I paid the driver, tipped him, and stood outside for a moment before going in. I looked up at the Parisian sky, a few stars visible despite the light pollution, faint but determined. I thought about all the people who had looked up at this same sky over the centuries. The Parisi in the island settlement 2,000 years ago, the Roman soldiers occupying Gaul, the medieval craftsmen building Notre Dame, the revolutionaries of 1789, the communards of 1871, the resistance fighters during the Nazi occupation, all the way to tonight, to me, another person passing through Paris and leaving nothing behind but footsteps that tomorrow's rain would wash away. I went inside, took the elevator to my floor, and collapsed onto the hotel bed without even removing my shoes. My feet throbbed, my legs ached, my back was sore, but I felt deeply, wonderfully satisfied. I had walked through Paris, really walked through it, and for one day at least, the city had revealed itself to me. Not just its monuments and famous views, but its layers, its history, its accumulated memory, its continuous transformation from past to present. I closed my eyes and let exhaustion take me, the day's miles settling into my bones, like knowledge gained through experience rather than study, like understanding earned through effort rather than simply given. Paris had become, for this one day, not just a collection of famous sights to be checked off a list, but a living city that I had experienced in my body, that I knew now in my muscles and joints and tired feet, that I would remember not as images on a screen, but as physical reality, as distance covered and history witnessed and beauty directly perceived. Thank you for listening. Good night.